When most people think of first-person shooters, images of Doom or Half-Life will almost uncontrollably come to mind, but for people like me who got into these games in the early 2000s, we have a few landmark titles of our own. Releases that may not have invented the wheel as far as PC gaming is concerned, but damn sure improved upon its design, and in that category, I don't think many would disagree that F.E.A.R may as well be running unopposed. So go grab a Surge out of the fridge, turn off Toonami, and gather around your CRTs, because today we are taking a trip back to the halcyon days of frosted tips and visible thongs. What's up guys, I'm Jared, and right now I am wearing a visible thong. Also, this is Avalanche Reviews. F.E.A.R, or First Encounter Assault Recon, a full title that will not be used again in this video, hit PCs in 2005 and was developed by Monolith Productions, a dev house that has churned out so many hits I doubt anyone watching this video over the age of 20 hasn't played at least one of them. But to talk about this title, we have to set up a bit of context. Around F.E.A.R's release, the first-person shooting genre was going through a bit of a metamorphosis. At this point, the thrill of being able to make these games consist of actual 3D assets was no longer a selling point, and if a title wanted to stand out, it really had to be doing something different. The modern military shooter was about 2 years away from taking the entire industry over, and I think it was in this narrow window of time we got to see some of the most impressive and experimental FPS games ever released. It was an era that mirrored the golden age of indie first-person shooters we're going through right now, and in that same vein, it was pretty damn exciting to live through. Back then, it seemed like every month we were getting hit with news about some kind of milestone release, and among them sat a little FPS that reportedly wanted to combine the chunky, stylish gunfights of a John Woo film with the style, flair, and black leather of the Matrix movies. And at the risk of jumping too far ahead, that is precisely what it did. But before we dive into our first slow-motion shootout, we've got to figure out exactly what we're supposed to be doing here in the first place.
He doesn't appear to be injured, although I don't know how he survived.
Worry about that later.
Feeling like equal parts Event Horizon and the X-Files, F.E.A.R mixes together my two favorite subjects, slightly grounded paranormal stories and political thrillers. A marriage that flat out doesn't sound like it would work, but somehow really does. The game starts out with a cutscene detailing a guy named Paxton Fettel breaking free from what seems to be his incarceration and murdering/eating his captors. After this, we're taken to the location we'll be in for the duration of this game's story, behind the eyes of a guy simply known as the Point Man, presumably having been recently promoted out of his last rank, Point Boy. Anyways, he's a relatively fresh recruit to a covert spec ops type of outfit named F.E.A.R. Our commanding officer goes on to tell us that this Fettel guy is actually part of a top secret experiment that has a gifted psychic leading a battalion of clones by essentially mind controlling all of them at once. This whole freak show being the work of a civilian company with government contracts called Armicam. Apparently, now that Fettel's loose, they have no control over the clone super soldiers they developed, and since our unit was basically put together to face threats exactly like this, F.E.A.R's being sent in to deal with things. In the first few seconds of this briefing, they make sure to let us know that Point Man is a brand new recruit, but despite his lack of experience, has some seriously good moves.
You've seen his training results. His reflexes are totally off the charts.
A little narrative trick that basically pre-explains why this guy can go all slow motion without anyone ever having a chance to ask. The first attempt at trying to get a hold of this psychic cannibal goes smoothly for like a minute, with F.E.A.R tracking his location to an abandoned factory. Not long after they get there, though, this evil genius manages to put the combined intelligence apparatus of the United States government to shame with a plank of wood. After waking up from one hell of a nightmare, Point Man gets to his feet and continues the pursuit, only this time with the help of a few Delta Force operators. Sadly, they don't make it too long into the mission though, but in their defense, we nearly don't make it out of there ourselves. After waking up from his second concussion in the last few hours, Point Man hops on a helicopter headed for Armicam headquarters. Fettel seems to have set his soldiers loose on the place, which means he's likely to be there as well, and I think now's a good time to mention that you won't exactly be getting a full view of this game's story by just playing through it and taking in the cutscenes. Of course, you'll see most of what's important, but you can get a sizable amount of side story just by listening to answering machine messages and breaking into laptops. These little lore dispensers are scattered around the entire game, and at first they can be a little hard to follow. You'll often come across these things out of order and mixed in with the ones that'll deliver small pieces of story or ones that have no real purpose other than slight world building. Now, the less important audio logs may not give out the kind of information that pertains to the story in general, but they are entertaining as hell, chronicling stuff like some bigwig higher up getting reprimanded for workplace sexual harassment.
It's not that I personally give a rat's ass, but the last thing we need right now is a sexual harassment case drawing unwanted attention to this task force. It's supposed to be a secret after all.
It's great having stuff like this and the radio broadcast included because they really do flesh out the world of F.E.A.R a little more clearly, but I can't imagine some people coming across a few of these mundane messages and deciding the rest might not be worth listening to. If you do sit through all of them though, they paint this really intricate picture of all the threads this little spiderweb has in it. Politicians, corporate moneymakers, and other sordid people of influence are all wrapped up in this thing, and some of them might be moving to get rid of any proof of their involvement. Even without all the side content, the story has this really cool political drama angle to it. There's all kinds of fancy-sounding acronyms being thrown around, mixing real-life government agencies with made-up sci-fi ones, and I just love that type of grounded fantasy approach.
Mike, it's Harlan Wade. Chuck Abiger seems to think that people are blowing smoke up his ass on this Perseus situation.
One that bundles its most unrealistic elements with enough real-life common knowledge to help offset any strain of suspension of disbelief on the player's part. Speaking of those sci-fi elements, throughout this whole ordeal, Point Man's been having these hallucinations concerning a little girl in a red dress and some kind of savage experiments or medical procedures. And if you ask me, the best part of these early missions is when you start to consider the option that maybe these aren't hallucinations. Even with all the stuff this game does so well, I think this one element is masterfully handled. I mean, sure, they do hint pretty hard at what's really going on here, but I doubt many people would be able to intuit the interesting little details that makes this ending so damn cool on their first playthrough.
He deserved to die. They all deserve to die.
Sadly, I can't say too much more without spoiling the story for you guys. And sure, this is a game that was released nearly 18 years ago, and maybe worrying about spoilers might not be the best use of my time in this scenario, but I feel like that defeats the purpose of making a video like this in the first place. It'd be dumb to ask you guys to play one of these games but then immediately spoil something about it that may make you want to do that. So if you haven't played F.E.A.R before and you want to go through its story on your own, two things I very much recommend you do. You can skip past this section by going to the timestamp on screen or clicking past the chapter marked spoilers. Don't worry though, we'll catch right back up with you guys after we've gone a little deeper. And if you think for even 1 second that I'm too mature for a "that's what she said" joke, you are sorely mistaken.
Stubborn little bitch, isn't she?
Like I said before, throughout the entire game, Point Man has been experiencing these visions. They always seem to include a little girl wearing red, and it seems clear something really bad happened to her. And as we uncover more of the details, things start really coming together fast. Turns out that girl in the red dress is named Alma, and she was the daughter of this guy, who was the head of something called Project Origin, a program developed to make use of her latent psychic abilities in some kind of way that Armacan can sell to the government as a tool of war. The details of that project being a little gross. So they essentially artificially inseminated Alma and used the resulting baby in those same experiments, which leads us to the fact that Paxton Fettel was one such baby. And much worse, this isn't even the first time this whole insurrection thing happened at Armacan. Seems like Alma was able to make a psychic connection with Fettel when he was a 10-year-old, which led to quite a few dead bodies, and Armacan basically sealing her up in a sarcophagus that she would eventually die in. And you'd think that'd be the end of the story, but somehow she's reached out and done it again. Now, this was an awesome little reveal, but the best part is we won't have to wait too long till we find out Point Man was also one of Alma's children, which does explain why he can kill a man with a slow-motion bicycle kick. After all of this, the goal becomes stopping Alma's biological father from releasing her or her corpse from the container it's in. We're not quite sure what'll happen if he does, but there's no way having a psychic version of the girl from The Grudge loose and walking around can be a good thing. Which is exactly why, if I'm elected president, my very first move will be to institute common sense psychic girl control laws. Because just one death coming from a little girl wearing tattered clothes and having long greasy hair is one too many, if you ask me. Well, anyways, we eventually get our hands on F.E.A.R, who is right smack dab in the middle of eating an innocent bystander who is also sort of Alma's biological sister.
I will set her free.
Point Man puts a round of 9mm through his head, stopping that little problem, but is just short of being able to stop Alma's release. Once she makes it out, we have this quiet little stroll back up to the surface where F.E.A.R's psychic troops are all out of commission because he's dead. We do end up having to face down a few of these ghost things, I guess, but otherwise it's pretty peaceful in F.E.A.R terms. After performing our own little exorcism, Point Man makes it out to the street, and there's this cool quiet moment where we get to wonder what exactly could be the worst thing a pissed off psychic mother could do when she's been separated from her kids. And it's not very long at all till we get an answer to that question, which turns out to be essentially a nuclear explosion. Making it out of explosion number 2 for the day, Point Man gets picked up by his fellow F.E.A.R members, and things seem oddly happily ever after until Alma climbs on board and everything goes black. After the credits roll, we get a Metal Gear Solid style phone call over a black screen, basically insinuating all of this was part of some kind of plan to test Point Man's skills, which is actually really cool. I love it when a game does this. Just when you think you've figured out exactly who everyone is and what's motivating them, some side character that's only ever been mentioned verbally so far turns out to be a key player. Very cool stuff. And I think that's about all the spoiler-heavy things I wanted to talk about, so let's meet up with the others.
Whatever, man. It's your call.
Goddamn right it is.
F.E.A.R's story started out with an amazingly interesting premise that hooked me from the very first scene, but unlike a lot of media that has the same effect on me, it managed to get even better as the mystery started to unravel. And I think a lot of that's due to the pace at which it was delivered. The game is almost always making forward progress with the story, and you're never more than 20 minutes of gameplay away from some kind of breadcrumb to keep you pointed in the right direction, even if that breadcrumb is unintelligible until you've actually beaten the game. And I'm sure most of that is due to the fact that it's only going to take you a good 7 or 8 hours to beat this game. Getting back on track though, I have always been a fan of the sort of political intrigue stories like this get up to. You know what I mean, the kind of story that has shady actors manipulating everyday events from the shadows cast by government organizations so secretive no one knows their name or who's in charge of them. So before anything actually went down, I was already well on board. But that's not to say that's all this story has to offer. There's also really well done science fiction, secret labs used to experiment on things most people would rather not know about, producing results that could be called supernatural. No matter how you swing it, there's a lot to love here, and it's all handled with enough care that none of this awesome potential is wasted. But this wouldn't be an Avalanche Reviews video if I didn't complain about something I really enjoyed, so let's get into the scant amount of criticism I have for this story. First and foremost, I think things could have benefited from a little more human-on-human interaction. A lot of the narrative we get happened in the past, or we're being told about it secondhand via some codec call. And that's definitely not the worst way to handle stuff. I mean, ask Hideo Kojima how he feels on the subject. But I think these kind of political thrillers work best when there's a large cast of interestingly shady characters making deals and betraying each other, and all of that definitely goes down in F.E.A.R, you just don't get to see much of it happening. Outside of the clone soldiers, the only people you get a face-to-face with are your teammates, some special forces operators with a very limited lifespan, Project Origin's director, and 3 Armacam employees. Now, this isn't the smallest cast in a video game, but none of them are there for very long, and it sort of gives off this vibe that the real story is happening behind closed doors while we just hear about it after the fact. That being said, I'm not sure there's very much that could be done about that. After the first cutscene plays, we rarely leave Point Man's perspective, and I'm not sure they had enough budget to take him to several locations that couldn't also be used as significant gameplay arenas. So maybe it's unavoidable, but it still would have been nice. The second problem is one I admit more of a small nitpick than a real issue, and that is the fact that we are inhabiting a mute protagonist. Now don't get me wrong, I get how much easier that makes the writer's job, but there are sections of the game you would at least expect your main character to make an offhand comment about. People talk directly to the guy, and instead of responding to their request, he gives them an earpiece so they can talk to someone else. To be totally fair, this wasn't something that got under my skin even the first few times I played the game, but now I can't help but notice how weird some scenes can be when Point Man refuses to even confirm orders he's received from his commanding officer. Other than those two very minute issues though, this was one hell of a stylish story. I was all in after just hearing the general setup, and even after that it managed to impress me. The twist at the end of the game, although not what I would call the most original idea, still caught me by surprise, and you know what they say.
Old tricks are the best tricks, eh?
F.E.A.R has an awesomely fun story, and I think it's one that'll offer something for everyone. It's kinda like Clear and Present Danger meets Ghost in the Shell while maintaining constant eye contact with The Conjuring, and if that seemingly random assortment of nonsense sounds like a fun time to you, good news, it is. Now get out there and eliminate some psychic ghosts for the United States government just like God intended. F.E.A.R most definitely had an interesting story, but I think we can all agree it's the gameplay that deserves the most attention, and I think that's fitting. After all, these guys were working on this project around the same time landmark titles like Half-Life 2 and Far Cry were being released, and if they were going to draw a crowd, they would need something worth looking at, which luckily was exactly what they had. At E3 2004, Monolith showed off their work so far, and while a lot of what would become F.E.A.R's main gameplay staples were very recognizable, it was the slow-motion gunfights that really stole the show, which makes a lot of sense given the time it was being shown off. After all, it was only 2001 that Max Payne had hit the scene, and the industry was very aware at how much a similar bullet time system could bring to a shooting game. And without a doubt, Monolith fits into that Johnny-come-lately category, but I think if this were just some cheap Walmart brand bullet time system, we wouldn't be talking about F.E.A.R today.
He's over here!
Slow motion will always be fun, but F.E.A.R needed something to really set it apart, and to be honest, I think that something consists of several gameplay, visual, and mechanical components put together. But instead of getting ahead of ourselves, let's do a little groundwork first. For those of you that haven't been looking at the screen so far, F.E.A.R is a first-person shooter, and as such, works more or less exactly like any other first-person shooter you've ever played. You shoot at people and try your hardest to get out of the way of any fire they might be returning. The one major difference being the fact that F.E.A.R wasn't exactly developed to be played in real time. Enemies are brutally accurate, and thanks to a combination of overwhelming numbers, great level design, and smart enough AI, they will often be at a severe advantage in a straight-up gunfight. Which leads us to F.E.A.R's reflex system. At the press of a button, you can slow down time around you while being able to move and aim at a much faster speed than anyone who's trying to kill you, and this all lasts as long as you have meter for it. This mechanic lets you line up some amazing trick shots and helps mitigate the psychically controlled soldier's ability to continue shooting you even when they're in a pain state from the 20 or so bullets currently entering their bodies. And if I'm being totally honest here, the fact of the matter is, enemy accuracy, movement speed, tactics, and flat-out numbers make the use of reflex almost completely necessary for everyone minus the most skilled players. I have previously tried to limit myself with how much I use it, and it really does make for an entirely different experience. A more frustrating one for sure, but maybe a little more satisfying in some ways too. Kind of like in a purposefully handicapped speedrun sort of way. Either way, this reflex system opens the doors for all kinds of stuff. You can shoot grenades as they're leaving a bad guy's hand, pop it for just a quick second to ensure that one shot of an unsuspecting soldier, and most interestingly, use it in tandem with melee attacks to make your own slow-motion kung fu scene. The melee button by itself is only going to produce a pretty bog-standard, although still useful attack with the butt of whatever weapon you're holding, but there's more to it than that. You can hit the melee key in the air for a very cool bicycle kick, or press it at the same time as the crouch key for a slide kick that is way too damn fun for its own good. Now, I'll be honest with you, I do not use melee attacks in combat as much as I should, because I often play at the highest or second highest difficulty, and at that point, just being invisible for longer than a second amounts to me signing my own death warrant. But on normal, these options really add a lot to the game, and if I'm being fair, they do in hard mode too, it's just a little more risky. I'm not exaggerating when I say fights that would normally be pre-scripted or pre-rendered in other games take place like every 5 to 15 minutes in F.E.A.R. You can run at a group of bad guys, firing guns akimbo, then slide kick the nearest threat while swapping to a shotgun and turning what used to be a human body into a cloud of red mist. It really is something you can't get anywhere else. On the more mechanical and less John Woo side of things, reflex mode is a great press this button to not die sort of thing. If you happen to walk into a room just a bit too fast and notice there are a few clones in there looking to jump you and start taking damage on both sides, popping reflex might give you the microsecond you need to get out of there and take some much needed cover. This really is a nearly perfect system they've got here. The only possible complaint I could have with it would be the fact that there aren't many uses for it outside of combat. I know it's a bit hokey, but I would have liked to have seen environmental situations that would require a little slowdown to deal with. I don't know, like maybe needing to slow down time so you could slide through a series of collapsing structures or get out of the way of something crazy. If I'm going to be totally fair though, there are a few sequences in the game that play out like what I'm describing, but I feel like they're more like cutscenes because you're on a single route and the game activates slow motion for you. I'm not exactly married to the idea or anything, but it does seem like a bit of a missed opportunity to not let us use reflex to solve environmental puzzles, but I guess I can be satisfied with it only being some of the best shooting gameplay ever seen in an FPS before. Being an early 2000s shooter, F.E.A.R is definitely going to play a little differently than what you might be used to today. At the time, FPS games were going through a bit of a transformation. You still had games mirroring that early 90s boomer shooter mentality like Painkiller, but other titles would chase after that Half-Life experience as well. And I think F.E.A.R might be a bit of both sides of that debate. It is a linear game that progresses things with Half-Life's more story-based approach, but the heavy action focus and almost arena-type design to spots where combat takes place definitely harkens back to that Doom style of things. And speaking of which, levels in F.E.A.R are relatively big and can be broken up by several loading screens. There are often a few of what you might struggle to call puzzles in between you and the goal for the area, but most of the time that consists of finding a button or valve that has some kind of mechanical effect on the level, allowing you to progress. These things are not what I would call interesting or unique for a game at the time, but they sort of had to be there, and I'm not really going to give them shit for including them. As you make your way through the game, you'll find very familiar FPS mainstays like armor that can absorb damage and medkits, although these health items can be used when needed instead of being automatically applied when you pick them up, which is a godsend. The one annoying-ass modern FPS trend that made it into F.E.A.R, which in my mind brings things down a bit, is the idea that Point Man can slow down time and dodge multiple shotgun blasts at once, but can't seem to muster the strength to carry more than 3 weapons at the same time. It can be insanely frustrating coming across a great weapon, but having to stop and cycle through what you have on you trying to decide which one should get the boot, and that gets especially bad in the latter sections of the game when you come across rocket-launching mechs. You're definitely going to want something like the particle gun or repeating cannon for these fights, but you rarely come across ammo for those guns, which means you'll need to keep them in your inventory unused until you come across one of these bigger enemies. But unless you've played the game before, you're not really going to be sure when or if you will. It seems kind of dumb to have a situational weapon like that clog up the very limited inventory space you have. Plus, it'd be nice having access to your rifle, handgun, submachine gun, and shotgun at the same time for a little more variety between gunfights without sacrificing the more powerful stuff. And yes, I hear you, it might be more realistic to have someone not be able to lift up all that artillery at once, but need I remind you, this is a game where these skeletons bleed when you shoot them. I really don't think we're going to have much use for realism around these parts. Weapon variety aside though, rest assured F.E.A.R's combat will have your brain glued to the back of your skull, and maybe not for the reasons you might think. I mean, sure, it is always going to be fun shooting at targets in slow motion and watching them burst into a shower of body parts and blood, but when those targets intelligently use the terrain to their advantage and pose a genuine threat to you, that fun gets multiplied exponentially. These guys never come alone to a fight, and while sheer numbers can affect difficulty, it's less about how many of them there are on screen and more about how well they work together. If you're spending too much time focusing on maybe 1 or 2 guys, the rest of the squad will start moving to take some kind of positional advantage of that. And they can do that because the areas these fights take place in are tailor-made to allow that kind of strategy. Racks and shelving can be toppled over to make some kind of obstacle, and their contents can be blasted into small bits, which may not affect gameplay per se, but makes fights look a hell of a lot cooler. Of course, you can use similar tactics yourself, popping out of hiding and taking pot shots, but if one of them sees you, they'll call it out to the group with an incredible amount of accuracy. No joke, they recorded lines for like 70% of the environmental assets in the game, so if you're hiding in, behind, or on top of something, they will be able to verbalize it most of the time. On top of that, there is a lot of variety in the scenarios you'll encounter these guys in, which means there's going to be a lot of ways to get in and out of the place, and oftentimes you'll notice a nice amount of verticality to that as well. So not only are you constantly having to watch your back, but sometimes you got to keep an eye on the air above you as well. Having these guys pose such a real tactical threat really ramps up the shooting in this game, which has led to a lot of people saying stuff like this is some of the most advanced AI you could find at the time, but in reality it's just a great combination of smart level design and well implemented but normal AI. Speaking of the shooting, while it's mostly incredible, it can also be a mixed bag at times. I mean, actually firing the guns feels cool enough, and the bullet trails they leave in slow motion makes them feel like they're powerful as hell, but a single mouse click will have several rounds coming out of them at once, which normally is a good thing. But I don't know, something feels off here. It's almost like there's more sound effects taking place than recoil from the gun or bullets coming out of it. Now, this might be due to the fact that they only apply the sort of tracer look to a few of the rounds that come out of the gun, but either way, it always feels like there's some sort of discrepancy between the audio and visual feedback I'm getting from firing the gun. Something's off there. On top of that, nearly every weapon in the game is grossly inaccurate and kicks like a damn mule. I've got to assume this was some kind of balance decision because it's hard to imagine a developer purposefully making guns in a first-person shooter hard to shoot, but regardless of why, it is not ideal. Oh, and by the way, this is Future Jared here. I was wrapping up this script when I found something out about this game that for me was totally new information, but for a good percentage of you is common knowledge, and you're probably wondering why I've yet to bring it up. Like I was saying before, these guns are inaccurate as hell, right? Well, it turns out there's a bit of a fix for that, but it's going to require you to manipulate some jank. In F.E.A.R, your aiming reticle gets bigger when you're moving because obviously you're not going to shoot as well in a dead run as you would standing still. Well, F.E.A.R, very uncommonly for its day, offered a lean key that would let you peek around corners, and while it does that job pretty well, it's actually something you might want to use no matter how far you are from the nearest corner. So you take these two ideas, combine them together, and the result is, for some reason, when you're leaning, you don't take that movement penalty to your bullet spread. And when you do that, you may notice that most of your shots are actually landing now. I felt like some kind of a genius when I figured this out, because watching other people cover F.E.A.R, I noticed them doing this a lot, and I was wondering what the purpose was, but I guess not enough to type a few words into Google. I guess it's a good thing I decided to stream F.E.A.R last week randomly, or I wouldn't have stumbled across this, so you're welcome if you never knew that existed, and if you did, I'm sorry it took me so long to talk about it. I'll go ahead and give it back to past Jared for whatever nonsense he was talking about before. Jesus, it's so cool. I'm gonna need to capture more footage, guys. Of course, the whole accuracy and kick thing is secondary to the fact that the shooting in this game is still an absolute blast. The effects your bullets have on your enemies will have them taking positional damage based on where you shot them, and anything after the killing blow will have them flying through the air in a very satisfying way. Sometimes you'll plug a bad guy just as he is about to jump over something or roll out of the way, and they maintain that momentum when they ragdoll, leading to some of the funniest and most entertaining shit you'll probably do in a video game. On that same note, there are all kinds of environmental hazards to both look out for and use to your advantage. They all, of course, blow up and can really turn the tables in a bad fight, but to be honest, I always find myself so caught up in shooting at people that I rarely use these things the way that I should. Coming from a modern standard, it is a little hard getting used to an FPS that doesn't let me sprint, but your basic walk speed's so fast, you'll almost never need to anyways. And hey, I know I've been a bit critical so far, and Fair warning, I'm about to get way more so, and oftentimes that can come across as disingenuous, sort of like I'm shitting on the game because it's popular. But I want to assure you, I really do love F.E.A.R, and if you're just looking at it as a loose assortment of singular, linear combat sequences, it's gonna be perfect, but I think it's the material that links those sequences together where things start to really grate on me. Now keep in mind, none of these things I'm about to talk about are too significant on their own, but together I think they can bring down what is otherwise a really awesome time. For example, like I've said a million times, getting into a firefight with a bunch of smart enemy opponents is where F.E.A.R shines, but getting to the spots where those fights take place can be a big issue sometimes. And believe me, it's not going to be something you'll notice until you put some time in. See, the starting warehouse has a killer design to it, and the route forward will always be pretty intuitive, but once you enter the Armacam building, and later on the secret bunker, the environments start to become more of a threat than the soldiers looking to gun you down. I say that because the scenery can be so damn repetitive and samey looking that you'll spend long periods of time navigating the same 4 rooms just trying to figure out what the path forward is. I shit you not, during this playthrough I ran into maybe 3 or 4 situations that had me stuck looking for the next area, and when I finally found the right hallway, it turned out to be one that I kept deciding not to go down because it looked so damn similar to the one I had just come from. So a not insignificant chunk of my playtime was spent running around wondering where the hell to go, despite the frustrating fact that it was in front of me all along. It just looked so similar to where I'd come from, I assumed I was going in circles. And maybe that'd be something that you could account for, but realistically speaking, thanks to the way the levels are designed, you will actually be going in circles a lot of the time as well. I imagine someone playing this game for the first time would think the game was more cryptic and labyrinthian in layout than it actually is because of this. And a contributing issue is the fact that the game really messes up its own pace right around the part where the earlier problem I mentioned comes into play. Once you enter the Armacam building, F.E.A.R starts throwing really long sections at you where combat will be less frequent, or at the very least it seems like it is due to all the wandering around you'll be doing when you eventually get lost, which you will get lost. And even if you know this layout of this part of the game really well, there's an issue that might get in your way still. In this office building area, you'll be in the dark a good portion of the time, and in F.E.A.R, dark sections aren't your typical video game style of darkness, aka a simple reduction in brightness. No, in F.E.A.R, black levels are real deal pitch black, meaning zero visibility, and not often, but sometimes this darkness will be obscuring a door or hallway you need to go down. Now, the game does give you a flashlight to combat its inky black levels, but for some insane reason, they decided to give it its own cooldown timer, which I guess might contribute to a tense situation in something like Silent Hill. But in this game, we have access to a gun that shoots metal bars into people, pinning them to the environment. The tension mostly comes from the combat, and even if it was an atmosphere thing, the damn flashlight is usable almost immediately after it's been fully depleted, making the whole process kind of negate itself. Instead of keeping things creepy, this mechanic boils down to keeping your flashlight on for 15 seconds, it turning off on its own, then having to wait less than 1 second before turning it back on again. This little frustration led me to not using the flashlight much since it's annoying to manage. Now, something like this could have definitely worked in a slower paced, maybe more horror focused game where, I don't know, the main character isn't described by the story as a literal
God among men.
Like I said before, these issues aren't enough to drag F.E.A.R down as a whole, but instead, they're more like little annoyances. It's not going to cause you to turn the game off or anything, but you might have less fun with it as a result. And really, it just dawned on me that I've been mentioning the whole horror thing a lot, but never really addressing it properly. F.E.A.R, if the name didn't already give it away, strives for a bit of a scary vibe on top of all the awesome shooting. And while I think a lot of people over the years have really overhyped this very small focus, it's still an awesome little companion to the rich atmosphere Monolith put together here. What that boils down to is some really creepy music, awesome lighting, a lot of darkness, and every once in a while the game will throw out either hallucinations or straight up attempts at jump scares, and they actually work pretty well. Or at least they used to. Since I know all this stuff is coming now, it doesn't work on me the same way it did when I first played the demo for F.E.A.R on my old Dell Optiplex pre-built, but they're still great to have around. If you ask me, I'd say that having the fear of having the game scare you mixed with the tenseness of not knowing when the next challenging combat section is going to pop up makes for a great little combination. On top of that, your time outside of combat will be spent listening to the creepiest tunes you can imagine. All kinds of cool electronic soundscapes dot the OST here, with a lot of distorted and reverse vocals. Very effective mood-setting music without a doubt. On the more technical side of things, I only ran into one issue when it came to running this game on a modern machine, and it was a very weird drop to exactly 33 frames per second at random intervals. I couldn't really say what caused this, but I found a fix at the PC Gaming Wiki that took care of it with zero tinkering. Just download the DLL and drop it into your install directory. I'll go ahead and link that fix in the description if anyone wants to make use of it, and for those of you who don't regularly run old PC games on modern computers, trust me when I say only facing one of these problems and being able to solve it with little to no effort, well, it's not very common and it's always appreciated when it happens. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure who out there needs to hear this from me nearly 17 years after its release, but F.E.A.R is one incredible game. It most definitely suffers from a few design tropes common at the time, along with a few of its own uniquely bad developmental decisions, but it is without a doubt a classic among classics. You might get a little annoyed when you spend more than 10 minutes just trying to figure out exactly which one of these similar-looking cubicle-littered offices you haven't explored yet, but the second a unit of psychically controlled clone soldiers drop in from a skylight and you slow down time to score a perfect headshot, sending them flying through the air, well, I doubt there'll be very much of that annoyance left in you. F.E.A.R took a few commonly seen gameplay features that were coming to popularity at the time and mixes them together to form something totally different, and the result is a game that is an absolute blast to play through. However, there were a few expansion packs released for F.E.A.R, which for those of you too young to have ever heard that term, just think DLC you could actually buy in a physical form. But anyways, Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate were released 1 year from the original and each other, and personally, I've never really enjoyed stuff like this. And listen, I get the concept, it's just supposed to be more of the game you love, right? I've always been a buy a game once and that's it kind of guy. Expansion packs were all well and good, but when this shit was coming out, I was working a part-time job at Dunkin' Donuts. I could barely afford the gas it would take me to go out and get the expansion pack, let alone the expansion pack itself. So this was actually my first time with these releases, or at least one of them. It's complicated. Starting off with the first follow-up, F.E.A.R Extraction Point has you right back in the Point Man's shoes directly after the conclusion of the base game. The story is sort of nonsensical here, but to be fair, at the time of recording this, I still haven't beaten it, which is going to make what I'm about to say sound a little dumb, but I think I might like this expansion pack more than the base game. Now to clarify, Extraction Point just builds off of F.E.A.R proper, so it's not like I'd recommend skipping straight to this one, but if you are someone who's already experienced F.E.A.R, EP offers everything you can get from the base game and a little more. Not only does it favor combat much more heavily, but those combat sections are doled out at a much faster pace. There's no doubt F.E.A.R's first release spent a lot of time on having you move through eerie sections of an environment so it could set up a scare later on or just lay down another thick coat of that sweet atmosphere. But EP knows you've already seen all that, so it wastes no time getting straight to the point, and that point is throwing way more enemies at you and giving you a few more methods to deal with them. There's no doubt the game could turn sour at some point, and I just haven't gotten there yet, but I feel pretty safe saying if you liked F.E.A.R, you're guaranteed to like Extraction Point and maybe a little more. And I think more is a very fitting word to use here. In EP, you'll fight more enemies at once, use more weapons to put them in early graves, and it's all wrapped up in F.E.A.R's absolutely stunning visual presentation. But I guess that doesn't follow the motif very well, so how about you get to see more environments? Nailed it. Truth be told, I feel a little dumb for... You are dumb. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you marriage. Truth be told, I feel a little dumb for waiting this long to play Extraction Point, and having said that, I've got some good news and some bad news for you, so what do you say we start off with the bad news? For whatever reason, Perseus Mandate, the next and last of the F.E.A.R expansions, can't be bought on its own, or at least that's how it is on Steam and Good Old Games. On both platforms, it can only be obtained when buying a pack containing a bunch of other stuff I already own, and I don't really feel like jumping through even the easiest of hoops for a game that most people agree isn't very good or at best doesn't live up to the original or Extraction Point. So you're gonna have to go without my opinion on this one, but on the plus side, Mandalore Gaming has covered F.E.A.R in a video, and let's face it, dude did a much better job than I could anyways. So if you want, maybe play his F.E.A.R review and crank the bass on your speakers, that way it'll sound like an Avalanche Reviews video, but it'll have all the killer quality of a much better content creator.
Is anyone still out there? Anyone but them, I mean.
Quality content creators aside though, F.E.A.R most definitely lives up to the hype. And I mention hype specifically because with classic games like this, there can be a lot of rose-tinted glasses, keeping it from getting a real close examination with a critical eye, but after doing just that, I have found it to most definitely justify its beloved status. To this day, when I boot up a random game of F.E.A.R, I get very excited at the sound of the clone troopers' radio callouts because it means there are enemies nearby and I get to remake some kick-ass scene from Hard Boiled. And just in case there's any question, if you can hear my voice right now, stop listening to it and go play F.E.A.R. It was way ahead of its time when it was released, and thanks to that, it is just as thrilling and fun to play now as it was almost 2 decades ago. When F.E.A.R first started making its initial showings on the web and at industry events, the gameplay most definitely took center stage, but the game's presentation occupied a spot I'd like to call the center of center stage. To put it succinctly, F.E.A.R looked fucking incredible, and that's saying a lot when you take into account the bangers we would have in front of our eyeballs in 2005. There was Far Cry, Half-Life 2, Doom 3. We weren't exactly hurting for AAA GPU melters at the time. And maybe this statement won't mean very much to people who weren't following gaming news around the early 2000s, but a title not only competing with the mammoth that was Half-Life 2, but surpassing it in terms of lighting and flashiness, that was something to sit up and take note of. My very first experience with F.E.A.R came in the form of one of those demos that came with PC Game Mag, and I can specifically remember sitting at my parents' Dell pre-built with the woman who would eventually become my wife, spending upwards of 20 minutes trying to dial in the perfect combination of barely running the game at a decent frame rate and being able to see all of its graphical glory. And while that initial experience might have been a little different from yours, I'll bet you $5 we shared the same first opinion. That being, holy hell, this is some amazing looking dynamic lighting. Now don't get me wrong, the particle effects, blood spray, and damage decals were all mouth-watering as well, but F.E.A.R is absolutely nothing without its great looking real-time dynamic lighting. A fact that is made severely evident in the small minority of locations that use bright, flat, static lighting. These sections certainly don't look bad, but when you go from one location to another, you will definitely notice a steep drop in impressiveness. Of course, not every light source is going to blow your mind. Obviously, there are the aforementioned static lights and even some pre-lit textures, but there's enough dynamic fixtures and fluorescent tubes dotting the landscape that the look remains unbroken. And it certainly doesn't hurt that F.E.A.R uses my preferred method for these things. A lighting style I've talked about to no end in my Metro series of videos, which is that opaque, sharply defined look that defined the era it was released in. I know a softer, more blurry-edged light shaft looks far more realistic, but this is what I grew up on and it's what I prefer. Another element that helped F.E.A.R stand out was something I briefly touched on before, and maybe this is one of those only Jared things, but I've always sort of been interested in video game black levels. Most games just decrease brightness in a certain area, with the game world still being visible, but a little more dim. However, there are a few titles, F.E.A.R being chief among them, that go for those realistic inky black levels, which produces the kind of darkness that without a flashlight makes seeing absolutely impossible. And it's the combination of F.E.A.R's dynamic light sources and the impenetrable real-time shadows they cast that come together to really sell the game's environments. Which is really good because without them, these would be some pretty simplistic looking locales. Sure, you'd still have all the cool particle and slow motion effects, which are without a doubt amazing to look at, but thanks to how geometry and assets had to be formatted to make the intricate level design work with the AI, things seem pretty cut and paste when they're not lit to perfection. But just to reiterate, that's a scenario that you're not going to come across very often, so don't take this as a downside or anything, but more like a really interesting look at how the game works. Since I already mentioned the visuals associated with combat, I have to give it up to the genius decision to include a lot of debris on screen when firefights get hectic. According to Monolith, the goal here was to mirror that wild, busy look the screen had in any given shootout in a John Woo movie, and I'd say mission accomplished on that one, guys. During this playthrough, and really any other I start, I get overly excited when I come across a combat scenario that has shelves full of garbage or maybe windows in between me and the enemy, because it means I can make one hell of a mess of the place in slow motion and then stop reflex mode and watch all the garbage hit the ground at once. First are the very over-exaggerated blood effects that we all have to pretend we don't actually think is really cool so we don't look like a teenager, but they look great and help further trash the environment after a fight. But even more cool than that is the ability to cut a motherfucker in half with a shotgun. Something I would assume is universally loved, and if it's not, well, it should be. Jibbing is incredibly satisfying here, as it is anywhere else, and the ragdoll physics act as the cherry on top of one masterfully crafted cake. Obviously, these guys aren't moving around realistically when you send them flying through the air with a single headshot from an MP5, but this style of ragdoll physics was common at the time, and I think because of this and Max Payne 2, I've developed a bit of a taste for it. Now, if you've been paying attention for this video, you might have caught the theme that F.E.A.R seems to look much better than it actually does, or I guess more accurately, for every shortcoming it has, there's a disproportionately higher quality counter to it. Sure, the environments may be so simple you can count the huge geometric shapes that make them up, but it's lit in a way that ensures no one but the most nitpicky would even notice that. And in that same vein, character models are incredibly blocky with all kinds of sharp angles jutting out everywhere. I'll admit, this looks great for the models you'll be looking at most, aka the clone troopers, but when a cutscene has normal people on screen, you will definitely see what corners were cut and where. So you might be asking, what's the counterbalance to this? Well, some absolutely stunning high-res textures. I mean, look at the stubble on this dude's head. As someone who shaves their head every single day, let me assure you, this is spot on. My man's looking like he's getting in there with a straight edge razor. The textures wrapping around the bigger elements in the environment may be a little less good looking, which makes sense. I mean, they're being stretched across a much wider surface area, but small stuff like the face and hands are really incredible to look at. And if you ask me, Incredible perfectly sums up F.E.A.R's entire visual presentation. Even today, thanks to a focus on great lighting and post-processing effects, F.E.A.R stands out as being particularly good looking. We've definitely got a lot of impressive stuff to look at nowadays with ray tracing and very realistically behaving light sources, but honestly, I think F.E.A.R still looks better than a lot of stuff on the market today. And some of you guys are going to think that sounds ridiculous, and that's perfectly fine, but I think a testament to how good F.E.A.R looks is the fact that a lot of the people who disagree probably see where I'm coming from. But hey, you guys know there's no game impressive enough that I won't pick it apart for no reason at all, so let's talk about the very small collection of flaws I found with the picture here. And since we were just talking about character models, let's start there. While the textures wrapped around these guys look great, there is a plasticky sheen coming off of them at all times, making the few regular humans you meet throughout the story seem to be toys that have recently come to life. Or actually, now that I'm thinking about it, tell me right now this guy doesn't look like he belongs in that Primus video for Winona's Big Brown Beaver. And yes, that's not exactly an issue since most of the game is spent not looking at these characters, but the same plasticky, shiny look affects some of your weapons as well. Also, and this is a much smaller thing, but most weapons don't have a reload animation. Instead, relying on an old trick in FPS games where you have the gun just drop below the screen and come back reloaded, which isn't a huge deal, but it does sort of seem low effort compared to everything else in the game. Now this next one I know I've already talked about, but the cookie cutter design of some areas makes it seem like they had a few templates for every kind of room and would just repeat that same exact design over and over again across a level. In their defense though, they're pretty good looking templates. And lastly, big wide open areas are definitely not the kind of environment this engine was made for, so on the very few occasions something like this is visible, it's not gonna look great. Warts and all though, this game is still a heavy hitter and I defy any of you to not be impressed with how great it looks. However, we aren't done yet. You guys know I love me a good port comparison. Which is good because F.E.A.R saw versions released on both the PS3 and Xbox 360, and I just so happen to have both in my possession thanks to some very generous backers over on my Discord server. Both of them know who they are, and I am incredibly thankful for their help. That being said, I've always been a Sony guy myself, so I think we should start off with F.E.A.R's PlayStation 3 port and see what it has to offer.
No sign of enemy activity on the satellite, but don't take any chances.
About a year after F.E.A.R hit the market, the PS3 would drop, and with this game being such a hit on PC, it was only a matter of time before it was folded and formed into a console-friendly version of itself. In 2007, our goth, slow-mo, gun-kata sim found its way onto Sony's Black Obelisk, and the results are, well, they're something. First off, the game targets a pretty bog standard for its day, 30 frames per second, although it's rarely able to live up to that. But on the plus side, it does output a native 720p picture, which may sound like a downside, but for those of you that don't know, a lot of games in the 360 and PS3 generation would run at an actual resolution of 720p or below, and oftentimes this would be upscaled to 1080p internally depending on your settings. I'm not exactly against that process, but there is a bit of sharpness and detail that can be lost there, and in most cases, native video output is going to look much better. There is a big caveat though. This only benefits people rocking native 720p panels or TVs that allow for such low resolutions to be shown in a pixel by pixel mode, aka with no scaling. And realistically, there's not a whole lot of that going around. Luckily, my monitor lets me do just that, and I don't know, there's something really okay looking about 720p when you look at it like this. I mean, it's not ideal and you might have to squint at it a little bit, but it's much better looking than stretching that picture out across your entire monitor or TV. And next up, I'm sure at least some of you are wondering what exactly was toned down from its PC release in order to get it running on console, but that's something I'd like answered as well, because as far as I can tell, other than the lower resolution, there hasn't been a lot altered here. The dynamic light sources are present and accounted for, and they don't seem to be running in any kind of a diminished form. Enemy counts seem the same, and particle, explosion, and slow motion effects all seem to have nearly perfect parity with the original. Some textures do look a little more muddy, although that's probably due to the resolution and not any kind of tinkering, but all the stuff that counts seem to have made the transition really nicely. Other than the whole frame rate thing, this game often drops below its 30 FPS cap and sometimes dips into the high teens, and you'd think that'd have me dissing this fast-paced shooter for messing with its smooth gameplay, but honestly, it works really well somehow. Without a doubt, 30 frames per second is never going to be ideal in a shooting game like this, but aside from the general inconvenience of that, things seem to flow pretty well in combat, and maybe that's due to most of it taking place in slow motion, but even at full speed, it felt really good. Plus, even when things start to lag, the game never seemed to resort to disabling VSync, which means I didn't have to look at any ugly screen tearing. I, as usual, had issues doing well with the controller, but I was getting the hang of it by the end, and it's more than playable, even with the massive dips in FPS. Audio seems to be roughly the same despite this very weird issue that had some select sound effects playing much louder than everything else in the game. I did find the controller layout to be very unintuitive, but like I said before, this game occupied that weird middle period before controls in FPS games would be more or less standardized across all major releases, so I guess you kinda have to expect that. There were some problems I ran into though. First off is something that's actually pretty common for me. I always seem to press the thumbstick in when things get tense in combat, and in F.E.A.R that makes you crouch. So there were quite a few moments when I'd be living out a teenage power fantasy with guns when all of a sudden I'd drop to the floor and start shooting upwards at enemies like a toddler. Also, the load times are pretty damn significant. I can't really remember what kind of load times I was dealing with on the PC back when this port was released, but on my current computer the load screen may as well not exist, so this long of a wait was pretty damn noticeable. Across both console ports, I found an issue where timing your melee combinations was really hard for some reason. I would try to hit the two buttons nearly at the same time or maybe spacing them out a bit, but I never managed to find that rhythm where these moves would come out reliably. And lastly, this is another issue that affects both 360 and PS3 ports, but for some reason they make you hold the interact button instead of just pressing it. And it may sound small, but when you're playing a fast-moving shooter like this, having to stop in your tracks for what feels like an eternity to open a door or pick up a weapon really eats into the intended experience. It did have a noticeable impact on the pace at which I played the game, but those relatively minuscule issues aside, I was actually pretty impressed here. At the time this was made, a good PC to console port was not the standard, and trust me, I have played much worse attempts. I did have some issues with the decisions that went into fitting the controls into one of these, but overall the core gameplay remains pretty unaltered, to a really surprising degree. I know this isn't exactly the in vogue console to have nowadays, so I doubt anyone will need to use this advice, but if you happen to find yourself on a desert island with only a power outlet, a copy of F.E.A.R, and a PS3, you'll probably have a good time. Obviously, Microsoft wasn't about to let Sony bogart all the good ports, and I think I might have to give the 360 the gold star on this one. First off, we have a 1080p picture, but I think this might be native internal 1080p because it is much more detailed looking than what the PS3 had to offer. Like the PS3, the 360 targets 30 frames per second, only it seems to actually be able to keep that up a majority of the time. There were of course moments where the frame rate would drop just a bit, but overall it was impressively stable. Even in this relatively simple section in the intro mission, the PS3 has a hard time staying above 22 frames per second, but the 360 just trucks along with no issues. Sadly though, the 2D assets didn't seem to get the memo about the higher operating resolution, and stuff like text looks pretty damn bad. Like you'd imagine, the more steady frame rate leads to a much smoother playing experience, but to be honest, I struggled a little more with this port as far as hitting my enemies and running around in a fight goes. But I'm pretty sure this has a lot to do with the state my 360 pad's in. The analog sticks have huge dead zones, the whole thing is a mess, and sometimes buttons stick. I also tend to have a preference for PlayStation controllers, so take this as a highly subjective opinion, and if you're more used to that style of controller and own one that actually functions, assume you'll have a perfectly fun time. I promise though, even if this port could only be played with a controller that physically injured its user, it would still be well worth it. Because for some reason in this port and this port alone, you can dual wield a pair of SMGs. So let's stop beating around the bush and get down to brass tacks. If your concept of cool slow-mo gunfights does not include double fisting a pair of submachine guns, I don't think this whole thing's gonna work out between us. These things really make for a fun addition, and they even function differently from the base MP5 that they admittedly look a lot alike. There's a different sound effect, and it seems to have a slightly different rate of fire. This is a very awesome treat for Xbox owners, and I'm not quite sure why it's here, but it makes this port worth checking out on its own. And you might notice that this section is significantly shorter than the one before it, but that's because you can copy and paste most of what I said about the PS3 port here. So if I didn't mention it out loud, just assume it's exactly the same across both versions. First off being this weird graphical glitch that'll sometimes show up on full screen meshes and effects. It'll mostly stay out of your way, but during the hallucinations or flashbacks, it's going to be pretty front and center. One-upping that problem is the odd shit going on just at the edges of the screen. For some reason, it's like the game's graphics fall just 1 pixel short of fully filling the screen, and that single pixel row is displaying garbage that maybe was meant to be in the overscan area. I'm not too sure on this one. I remember seeing something a lot like this way back in the day when I used a 16:10 monitor to play PC games. I'm not really sure if there's an overlap there, but what do you want from me? I can't know everything. Even when you consider that issue though, this is without a doubt the best looking and performing port out of the two. But hey, the fun most definitely does not have to end here. You guys know me, I'm into weird shit, and in that vein there is one more port to cover. One that sort of falls outside of the traditional definition of the word port, but if you're a dork like me, you'll definitely get a kick out of it. Me and the wife recently picked up a Series X, and I'm not gonna lie to you guys, a big portion of that decision was based on all of the classic Xbox and 360 titles it supports. Obviously, F.E.A.R very much being a part of that list. And I was thrilled to find out that the cornerstone of this list of backwards compatible titles is that some, if not all of them, benefit from a few really cool additions. For example, putting in your 360 copy of F.E.A.R will get you a native 1080p picture, something that looks insanely good. On top of the resolution boost, and I would argue most importantly, this version of the game runs at a locked 60 frames per second, and holy hell, talk about a game changer. Getting my hands on this straight after playing the other console offerings felt like a night and day difference, and without a doubt, this is the way to play an old copy of F.E.A.R. The combat flows expectedly better in 60 frames per second, and even though my ability to aim accurately with analog sticks is still embarrassing, I was having so much more fun here than before. Which means you not only get access to the dual SMGs here, which is already awesome, but you get them at a smoother frame rate, and I feel like that should end the argument right there. Sadly, I did not find any of the original 360 version's aforementioned problems fixed here, but hey, there is some value in a warts and all approach to porting stuff. Seeing this game running on console looking this crisp and sharp, plus running this smoothly, is really amazing. If you're one of the lucky people who managed to get your hands on a modern Xbox, don't have a PC, and are looking to play some F.E.A.R, well, trust me when I say you will be getting a near PC-perfect port of the game here. I may still find some of the graphical glitches very annoying, but even my petty ass has to stand in awe of how cool this is. I know it's sort of cheating, but if we're talking console ports, this is most definitely the winner, with the 360 version bringing up a not too far off rear. You know, I wrote the words "not too far off rear" in the script, and now that I've read them out loud, I swear to God I can't get out of my head an image of an old 1800s British rapper talking about a booty that's kind of close to him. Oh God, it's killing me. I have got to stop recording this stuff so late. But that absolute dumb nonsense aside, you guys know we got to see these things side by side so you can get an idea of how they'll look on your setup with your gear. And obviously the Series X takes best in show, but for what it is, the original 360 version is not as far behind as you would have thought. The PS3 version can look very blurry on this 1440p video, but trust me when I say native 720p with no scaling can look very good. It's a shame this port doesn't run as well as its 360 counterpart, or we'd have a really interesting competition here. Either way though, I don't think any of the three offerings are a bad choice. There may be a clear winner in my eyes, but none of them are losers. And because without fail, I can never finish a video without some kind of insanely last minute addition, we have one more thing to check out before we wrap this bad boy up. So there I was, streaming a little F.E.A.R the other night, and a channel member just casually mentioned something called F.E.A.R Complete Edition, and my ears perked right up for that. I had never heard of this before, but apparently it's a sort of F.E.A.R super mod that combines elements from all of the officially released titles, including the expansion packs, and combines it all into one story following the events from the first F.E.A.R game, Extraction Point, and Perseus Mandate. They took weapons, enemies, mechanics, and effects from F.E.A.R's 1, 2, and 3 and threw them all into one really cool package. The standout note for me being the fact that they got rid of the original game's shotgun and replaced it with the one from F.E.A.R 2. That may not be the best F.E.A.R title ever made, but it had one hell of a shotgun. I'm actually playing the demo here because I couldn't get a DirectX version to install without issue in the full release, but I've got to assume that's not a problem for everyone because a lot of people seem to like this thing. And you know, after playing the demo for this video, I think I'm ready to count myself among them. Maybe if I wasn't already running severely late with this review, I would have been able to devote a little more time to troubleshooting, but I'll put a link in the description if this sounds like a cool idea to you guys. On the plus side, you won't need the base game to play it because much like Stalker Anomaly, this download is the full package, game and all. So I see no reason at all you guys shouldn't just go out and try this thing out for free because why the hell not? Well guys, I think we've been pretty thorough with this one. I typically like to go in real deep with the game, but this one specifically had a lot of stuff to talk about. Hopefully, among all that nonsense, you got the impression that F.E.A.R is an incredibly fun, damn near mandatory gaming experience because that's most definitely the mood I was trying to put out. It might not have been revolutionary in its day since it was just a homunculus made up of the era's popular shooting tropes, but it mixed those elements in with a sharp eye for design, a horror focus, and the stated goal of developing something that makes shooting stuff fun. And I hope it doesn't need to be said that they achieved that goal to a staggering degree. You know, a lot of times when I recommend someone go back and play a game from this long ago, there's a worry that it may clash with the sort of expectations we have for modern titles, but I'm very happy to say that is not an issue here. Other than the controls being a little wacky to a modern FPS fan, this plays like a way more fun version of something you're probably playing right now on Steam. I guess one of the benefits of being this far ahead of your time is that you got a lot of shelf life. All the historical stuff aside though, this is just flat out a pulse-pounding, ass-kicking time. It's certainly not without its flaws, but after you've shot a grenade out of an enemy's hand in slow motion and watched as he and his friends turn from fully functioning humans with hopes and dreams into a loose assortment of body parts, none of that's gonna matter, I assure you. So quit listening to my nonsense and head to the link in the description. This is a game that everyone needs to play, and every second that goes by with someone not doing that, I count as a personal failure. I want to thank you guys for spending just a bit of your time with me today, and keep an eye out because I have a few more one-off type videos that I think you'll all get a kick out of. But until then, as usual, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Well, hello there, friends. Thanks so much for making it through all that rambling. If you made it this far, I've got to assume you'll enjoy just a little bit more, so I'll have some videos on screen you'll hopefully get a kick out of. And if you are looking to take this relationship to the next level, I do have a Patreon linked here on screen, along with a YouTube partnership program, which should be somewhere under this video. Well, I'm off to just barely meet another deadline. I hope you guys have a good day, and you know what? Scratch that. Let's make it a good week. Peace out, guys.